fighter jets take off from Saudi Arabia heading for Yemen, part of a Gulf coalition which has begun military operations against Houthi rebels who've been advancing on the country's second city of Aden.
In 2015, an Arab coalition led by Saudi Arabia intervened in the Yemeni civil war, with the stated aim of restoring the UN-recognized government. Since then, nearly 400,000 Yemenis have lost their lives, and over 4 million displaced, in one of the world's worst humanitarian crises.
About 80% of the population, 24 million people, need humanitarian assistance and protection. Some 20 million people need help securing food, including nearly 10 million who are just a step away from famine.
Britain has licensed nearly $7 billion of arms exports to Saudi Arabia and the coalition nations since the war started. And in 2018, a UN report alleged that UK and US weapons had been used in attacks which may amount to war crimes.
We have been providing the bombs that the Saudi-led coalition is using. We have been refueling their planes before they drop those bombs, and we have been assisting with intelligence.
So Yemen is in the Middle East, more specifically the Gulf, south of Saudi Arabia. And historically, Yemen is one of the most ancient civilizations in the world. It's very well known as the birthplace of Arabs, as the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, the city of Sana'a. So historically, Yemen played a big role in the region.
Most Arabs trace their roots back to Yemen, and so Yemenis are known as, so to speak, the original Arabs. If you're into coffee, Yemenis were the first to brew coffee that our Ethiopian brothers and sisters discovered. And so we have a long, rich history. And even during the times of the Roman Empire, it was a key exporter of all of the spices and frankincense and myrrh. And so it was known at a time by the Greeks and Romans as Arabia Felix for being this prosperous land.
The peoples who have lived in and who have traveled through this area of southwest Arabia have done so for millennia because of its rich agricultural base, some of its unique agricultural products that have long been coveted in religious ceremonies. It is also an important source of water, which fills the larger underground tables for Arabia, but has been successfully harnessed by these very resilient and quite efficient farming communities that you find that emerged over these areas. They're also master builders of, therefore, infrastructure, from dams, very famous ancient dams that have been referenced in some of the more widely read depictions, travelogues of these areas by Roman explorers.
So the Ottoman Empire ruled in what's commonly known as northern Yemen. And they were on and off essentially from the 1500s until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1918. And they were met with fierce resistance throughout that history. Yemenis are not people who, I don't think anybody likes to be subjugated. And Yemenis have certainly fought very, very fiercely for their independence from the Ottoman Empire. And so they left in 1918, and then they were replaced by a monarchy, a Yemeni family of monarchists, the Mutawakkalite Kingdom, which lasted until the early 60s when there was a successful coup. They had attempted previous coups, but this coup was successful in the 1960s to overthrow the monarchy in favor of a republic. And so that's the history of northern Yemen. And in the south, we have the British Empire, first the East India Company, and then the British themselves. were ruling the south of Yemen from its center, Aden, where I was born. But South Yemen also gained its independence through resistance in 1967 and was then ruled by the Middle East's first and to date only Marxist-Leninist country. And so it was a communist socialist country for a duration of time from the 60s up until 1990. And the country unified under President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had already been ruling North Yemen from 1978 onwards.
They've been shot at, beaten and tear-gassed, but they're not going anywhere. That was the message in Taz's Liberty Square as tens of thousands of people gathered once again to demand the president step down.
2010, 2011, huge uprisings, huge wave of uprisings across the Middle East, starting in Tunisia, but reaching Egypt, Libya, because all these countries are governed by similar kind of regimes, whether monarchs or presidents. They're authoritarian regimes, they're pretty corrupt, repressive, and the economic models aren't working for the general population. You know, people can't get jobs, or they can't get secure jobs. The jobs they can get are very badly paid.
I mean, he would win elections every 5 years by 99.9% of the vote. And so that's classic dictatorship. He would suppress his opponents, lots of political repression, lots of repression against intellectuals, anyone who would pose a threat, whether it was the Southerners in the South who were seeking secession or the Houthis in the North who were calling him out for his corruption. He responded violently and through war campaigns. But, you know, the U.S. loves its Middle Eastern dictators. And so he was propped up by the United States and by the Saudis. And he gave them free rein to do as they pleased in Yemen in the name of fighting terrorism.
The Jonas brothers are here. They're out there somewhere. Sasha and Malia are huge fans. But boys don't get any ideas. I have 2 words for you. Predator drones. You will never see it coming. You think I'm joking?
When I've asked the White House and the State Department for a shred of evidence that Abdullah al-Haider Shaya was guilty of anything other than journalism, critical journalism, they won't provide it. They just say what they often do: state secrets, trust us. This was a man who was put in prison because he had the audacity to expose a U.S. cruise missile attack that killed 36 women and children in the first strike that President Obama authorized. And cruise missiles are a devastating weapon. Cluster bombs, which are banned internationally. The United States is one of the only nations on earth that continues to use cluster bombs. We have video that's extremely graphic of infants being pulled from rubble, and children. 21 children were killed in that attack and 14 women.
Also talk about President Obama's phone call to the dictator Saleh.
Yeah, what happened is that, so Shaya is convicted in this kangaroo court, and then in February of 2011, the Saba news agency, the official Yemen news agency, did a report saying that Ali Abdullah Saleh, the dictator of Yemen, was going to pardon Abdullah al-Haider Shaya. That day, he gets a phone call from the White House, not from some undersecretary of who knows what, but from President Obama personally. And President Obama, according to the White House's own readout of that call, expressed his concern about reports that they were going to release Abdullah al-Haider Shaya. And just to give you a sense of what a client state Yemen was, the pardon then is ripped up, and he remained in prison then over the course of the next 2 years. The Obama administration has never had to publicly state why they killed 14 women and 21 children.
You think I'm joking?
At least 30 people are believed to have been killed in Yemen after pro-government troops reportedly opened fire on protesters in the capital Sana'a. Several allies of the president have recently defected to the opposition, calling on him to step down immediately and criticizing rampant corruption.
He initially resisted and didn't give up power, but then he did after an assassination attempt. And he was able to negotiate a deal that was overseen by the Gulf countries, the GCC.
As people in Yemen go to the polls, it's hoped a high turnout will give uncontested Vice President Abdurabu Mansur Hadi the legitimacy he needs to govern. Neighbouring countries helped broker a deal that will see power transferred to Hadi after the election, ending President Ali Abdullah Saleh's 33 years at the top.
They would have this fraudulent vote in which Mansur Hadi was the only candidate for this interim president. So there was basically a boycott of this whole christening of him as the kind of acceptable leader for all Yemenis.
In 2014, Yemen joined the World Trade Organization, signing up to a comprehensive program of economic reform.
Minister Talib, offer you my congratulations to you and to Yemen for joining the WTO family as its 160th member. Becoming a member of the WTO, Yemen has sent a very clear signal to traders and investors that the country is open for business.
What this all meant was the realization of an old agenda to integrate Yemen into the global system, a process started under Ali Abdullah Saleh, whose charismatic predecessor, Ibrahim al-Hamdi, is often regarded as the founder of modern Yemen.
But in time, with the arrival of Ali Abdullah Saleh, who removed a very popular interim leader of 3 years, who himself was considered to be a revolutionary. He was an advocate of preserving Yemeni sovereignty, a major advocate for allowing farmers to form cooperatives to determine what they grow. And this is exactly what the Americans, as evidenced from the archives that I was able to look at from the 1970s, the Americans were trying to introduce modern agricultural technologies into northern Yemen through their USAID projects, and Yemenis kept saying thanks but no thanks. We're not interested in pursuing the kind of harnessing of nature that you have seemingly perfected elsewhere. And Mansur Hadi, the first thing he does is sign with the WTO, which was something that the parliament refused to do under Ali Abdullah Saleh. No matter how much of a dictator he tried to be, an authoritarian, he still had to rely on even members of his own party who refused to countenance Yemen selling off its sovereignty to a regime which the WTO starts and demands of Yemen immediately, which includes redesigning their regulatory system, availing lands that had long been considered untouchable for the outside world. Again, the whole rationale that land should be exploited. There's these calculus that is introduced through ministry, through the IMF, and they had already well-designed plans, it seems. They knew the Yemeni economy, and they knew areas where they could see investment quality kind of growth that would bring in foreign investors, or at least regional investors. They were going to do microfinancing. They wanted to push microfinancing, and people would start being encouraged to take up small amounts of debt, which we saw the results elsewhere in India and Bangladesh. It led to the alienation of large numbers of people from their lands, which they relied on for generations to feed themselves and maintain a local economy.
Thousands of Yemenis were back on the streets of the capital Sana'a on Monday to protest against the government's decision to raise fuel prices.
The economic reforms that IMF were imposing, also much higher prices for everything from electricity to fuel.
We had rising fuel prices. I actually remember being in Yemen at this time, and the line at the gas stations was absurd. Really, it was a tough time in the country.
Many of the ministries who are not partisans, they're not appointees from political parties, they're professionals. So they would face huge austerity during this 2012-2014 period. Their salaries were being suppressed, their pensions, those things that were supposedly had been negotiated a long time ago are now under threat. So they were going on strikes.
Months before his ouster, President Hadi unveiled a plan to turn Yemen into a 6-region federation. The largest region, Hadramaut, would assume control of 80% of Yemen's oil production, despite being home to less than 1 in 10 Yemenis. According to a leaked US cable from 2008, the House of Saud has a long-standing ambition to secure this area for an energy pipeline.
Yemen is going to go finally to a federated zone where we're going to completely change how it's governed, and most of its assets and its wealth are going to be concentrated in a small group of people. Much of Yemen has not been explored yet. And you look at these geological maps of these blocks that have not yet been allocated for, and you can see the logic now of securing certain areas in this context of the war since 2015. For Saudi Arabia, they see themselves being shut out with the UAE now establishing through Fujairah its access to the Arabian Sea. They can circumvent Iran's leverage. And the Suez Canal is continuously proved to be impossible as a means to provide the supplies needed for Europe.
Now, the central government has been fighting the Houthis for a long time, a series of civil wars against this sort of insurgent group who are commonly known as the Houthis. And now the Houthis are able to come down from the north and grab power for themselves in the chaos.
Yemen has agreed a UN-brokered truce with Shia Houthi fighters seeking political and economic reforms.
The Houthis have received backing from Yemen's former president Ali Abdullah Saleh, who stepped down following mass anti-government protests during the Arab Spring.
They were only able to take over Sana'a because most likely he just had the army stand down and not pose any threat to them, and then became their political ally when the Saudis began bombing Yemen in 2015. So long-term enemy of the Houthis, he had waged 6 wars against them between 2004 and 2010, only to turn around and support them in their fight against the US Saudi-led bombing, only to turn against them again in late 2017, and within 48 hours he was dead.
Yemen's embattled government has called for military assistance from Gulf Arab states to stop the advance of Shia Houthi fighters into the south of the country.
They pushed the internationally recognised transitional government out of the capital, down into the south, and they seized a large chunk of the north of the country for themselves. And the aim is to restore the internationally recognised transitional government, not, let's stress, because of the Saudis, deep regard for international law or norms or whatever. It's more about the transitional government is a government that the Saudis are comfortable with, and the Houthis, the Saudis are not comfortable with. The Houthis are independent of the West, of Saudi, of the Gulf states. They're aligned to Iran.
The movement began by the Houthi family in northern Yemen, in Sada province, which borders Saudi Arabia. And they were a family of preachers and politicians. They had membership in parliament for a while, but they were speaking out against Ali Abdullah Saleh's relationship with the West and with Saudi Arabia, and against Saudi religious influence in Yemen, because Yemen has a long history of Zaydi Shia traditions and Sunni Shafi'i traditions. And yet we saw the influence of Salafi Wahhabi Islam from Saudi Arabia in the 90s.
Many of those people who had settled in Saudi Arabia to work in the service economies or in the oil industry became Saudis, culturally speaking. They became religiously much more conservative and quite distinctive from Yemenis back home. And they came in this huge flood back to Yemen. Yemeni economy couldn't harbor them. They couldn't find jobs for them. And so therefore, these poor, very conservative families we started receiving stipends from Saudi Arabia in a strategic move that would ultimately make them into a political force.
Basically, the Houthis originally were Zaidi. They have their own, I wouldn't call it completely separate religion, right? It's still a sect of Islam. It's between Sunni and Shia. So I don't think you can classify it as one or the other. It's really in the middle. And all of a sudden, Wahhabi schools from Saudi Arabia started to be built in their areas. And they were feeling this is discrimination. We don't want these schools in here. They're going to take out our indigenous practices of Islam. Additionally, I mean, it was a really underserved area. You weren't seeing a lot of schools. You weren't seeing hospitals from the state. So the Houthis had these historical grievances with the central government, in the sense of you're not helping us. And in fact, you're actively trying to get rid of our way of life.
And Saleh saw that as a threat, and so he responded by enlisting Saudis to battle them militarily. He tried doing the same with the US at the time, saying that they are funded by Iran, that their weapons that they were using against the Yemeni government were, transferred by Iran. And the Americans took this seriously because, like I said, Iran, USA, long-term enemies. But the investigations showed that they were actually getting their weapons from the Yemeni market, the Yemeni black market. In the US, in the West, we're conditioned to think about Iran as the great enemy. And so it's easy for people to understand, oh yeah, these are the bad guys.
Saudi Arabia is fighting Iran-backed rebels in Yemen, part of a broader proxy fight with regional adversary Iran.
The chaos in Yemen has suddenly expanded into a dangerous regional war with Iran on one side, Saudi Arabia on the other.
Iran-backed Houthi rebels.
Iranian-backed rebels.
Shiite rebels allied with Iran.
The Houthi rebels, who are predominantly Shia, backed by Iran.
The Houthi rebels who are backed by Iran.
Who is really responsible when 50,000 Houthis are able to, frankly, hold in hock 27 million people in Yemen. And we know where the finger points, I'm afraid, and it is to Iran.
The way this war ends is not in the hands of Yemenis because big regional powers have intervened. On one side, the friends of Iran, on the other side, the friends of Saudi Arabia, the US, and indirectly Israel. The people here are suffering because of the fault lines that run right through the Middle East.
Unfortunately, the war in Yemen is often used and described in two lenses. One is a proxy war and one's a sectarian conflict. Both are really inaccurate. So I would call the relationship between the Houthis and Iran a marriage of convenience more than a partnership. So now the Houthis have an ambassador even to Iran. But when the war originally started, they really did not have a close relationship at all. In fact, when the Houthis decided to storm the capital in 2014, the Iranians told them not to, and the Houthis did anyway. So this idea that the Iranians have control over the Houthis or the Houthis and Iran are really these close partners, it just doesn't hold up to the facts on the ground.
What is the U.S. position on how much involvement and the depth of involvement on the part of Iran, if any, whether militarily, financially, or otherwise?
Well, the Houthis have concerning relations with Iran, and we are aware of reports of a variety of support provided by Iran to the Houthis, but we have not seen evidence that Iran is exerting command and control over the Houthis' activities in Yemen.
We cannot have Iran involved in Yemen. Yemen is a strategically important country, 28 million people on our doorstep, and sits at the entrance of one of the world's most critical waterways, the Bab el-Mandeb, which also connects to another critical waterway, which is the Suez Canal. A very large percentage of world trade flows through the Red Sea, and if those waterways are controlled by hostile forces, it would present a tremendous danger to international trade.
Bab el-Mandeb Strait is where international shipping goes through. Anything going to Asia from Europe, anything going to Europe from Asia has to go through Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Whoever is in charge of Yemen controls that strait, and so it better be somebody who is a strong ally of Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the United States.
The shipping lanes through which oil supplies pass are really important kind of strategic points in the global system. Strategically speaking, from the British and American point of view, you don't want your strategic opponents, i.e. Iran or Iran's allies, like the Houthis, to be in a position where they can threaten shipping through an important sort of choke point like that.
Fighter jets take off from Saudi Arabia heading for Yemen, part of a Gulf coalition which has begun military operations against Houthi rebels who've been advancing on the country's second city of Aden. The Saudis say they responded to a request from Yemen's president.
We will do whatever it takes in order to protect the legitimate government of Yemen from falling and from facing any dangers from an outside militia. We have a situation where
At the UN Security Council, the Saudi invasion of Yemen secured the blessing of the Western powers. The Arab coalition has relied crucially on American and British support, from the steady flow of bombs and weapons to the deep maintenance of the fighter jets.
The US sells the Saudis and their coalition partners billions of dollars worth of bombs and provides intelligence and logistical support. Saudi jets are refueled mid-air by American planes between bombing missions.
We have been providing the bombs that the Saudi-led coalition is using. We have been refueling their planes before they drop those bombs, and we have been assisting with intelligence.
Because these planes are British and American supplied, they can't function without ongoing British and American support. You know, the British and Americans don't just sell you the planes and then that's it. See you later, enjoy those planes. They say, you know, the agreement says you will have these, we'll provide you these planes and we'll provide you the training, components, spare parts, maintenance, ammunition from the British and the American suppliers of the planes. You can't just swap that stuff out. You can't just get a Chinese, technician to fix a British-built jet. You can't get a Russian ammunition supplier to supply bombs and missiles that fit onto an American-made jet. That's not how this stuff works.
So there's a long-standing government-to-government agreement between Saudi Arabia and the United Kingdom, in which the two governments have agreed that the UK will supply weapons and engineering support and logistic support and training to the Saudi military. Now, the UK government has contracted that work out to BAE Systems. In Saudi Arabia, there are BAE Systems staff, and there are also RAF personnel who are members of the British military. But the extent of British and also US support for the Saudis is so extensive that, as we saw in that dispatches report, as we've seen in various long forms of reporting, if you take away that Western support, the Saudis wouldn't be able to get access to the parts. They wouldn't be able to load them onto the planes, to do the repair work, the logistical work. And so really, without that support, they wouldn't be able to carry out the war to any extent that they have been able to.
In terms of the Air Force, the Saudi Air Force, a huge chunk of it is made of British jets. So that relationship of dependence, it's not just a relationship of dependence with the Americans, it is to a large degree a relationship of dependence with the British as well, in that these British jets will not fly without that ongoing support, the training of the pilots, the maintenance of the jets.
The UN says Saudi coalition airstrikes are responsible for the majority of civilian deaths. It says they've hit schools, hospitals, markets, even funerals like this one, which killed more than 140 people in Sana'a last October.
They bombed hospitals, they bombed funerals, weddings, my personal favorite, an orphanage for the blind, food sources as well. My grandfather in Yemen, we had a chicken hatchery, they bombed that. Sana'a, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They've bombed heavily in that area. Really, so there's been nothing off limits.
The Houthi insurgents have also used, indiscriminate bombing of civilians, indiscriminate shelling of civilians, rather, and siege tactics on cities that they're trying to gain control of, which have had a similar effect.
There are, in fact, French-made warships being used by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to implement the blockade on rebel-held areas of Yemen. Those warships require maintenance. That is, upkeep, supply of spare parts, ammunition. That is done under contract by French companies.
As for the blockade, that's been, I would say, one of the main killers within Yemen. So this blockade, it does not allow fuel into the country. It didn't allow medicine. I work with Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, and we got a donation of enough leukemia medicine for every child who's sick in Yemen. We could not get it in. It ended up expiring. This is mainly to the blockade, but also due to these airstrikes that destroyed the limited resources we already had in the country. Yemen was the poorest country in the region. So we already didn't have much to begin with, and that limited supply has truly been destroyed.
The most conservative estimate is that 377,000 people were killed in this war, either by starvation or bombing. Getting medical aid and supplies into the country was impossible because of the blockade. Cholera was running rampant in Yemen. The worst outbreak in modern history happened in Yemen because there's no fuel in the country to operate the water pumps. People were drinking contaminated water, couldn't rehydrate with water because there was no way to gain access to clean water, and they were dying of preventable diseases like cholera and diphtheria and whatnot.
Yemen is an incredibly poor country. It's the poorest country in the region. It's also import dependent. If you blockade a country like that, a poor import dependent country, you know what's going to happen. This looks like it could be a case. This is the restrained language that the UN will use. It looks like this could be a case of starvation being used as a war tactic.
This is 4-year-old Shuaib. His grandfather brought him here with fever and diarrhea. Malnutrition has meant his immune system isn't able to fight a simple infection. And severe shortage of medicine means the antibiotic he needs isn't available either.
The antibiotics we have will not treat the type of bacteria that he is suffering from. All we can do is provide health care with the supplies that we have.
I never imagined I would ever see a child like this in Yemen. This boy is starving. It scares me that it may be the beginning of a famine.
According to UN figures, there are now 370,000 children with the same level of malnutrition as Selim. 4-year-old Shuaib's grandfather tells us his condition has taken a turn for the worse.
He just had fever and diarrhea, and because they didn't have his medicine, he passed away.
Save the Children estimated in 2018 that as a result of this man-made humanitarian crisis, 85,000 infant children, that's children under the age of 5, had died of starvation or preventable disease. You then have the worst cholera outbreak in recent history. Again, as a result of the destruction of the economy, destruction of civilian infrastructure, you have millions of people sort of teetering on the brink of starvation, not outright starving to death, but, at that level of, real hunger and real deprivation.
In response to cross-border attacks, Saudi Arabia began pounding the northern province of Sada. In violation of international law, The Saudis declared the entire Houthi stronghold a legitimate military target.
These militias have escalated the situation and targeted Saudi cities. That's why we need to protect the cities and to guarantee the safety of Saudi and Yemeni citizens.
Many residents did not learn of the Saudis' evacuation order and were effectively trapped.
حصل لي أنا وأسرتي إن إحنا بنقوم بأداء الفاتورة الصباح. الساعة يمكن 10:30. لا موجود معنا غاز ولا مسوين أي شيء ورجع ضربنا نساء وأطفال ورجال. أنا زوجتي و4 من بناتي راحوا. كلهم. وأخي ومرته و3 من عياله. هذا أبي والبي خارجي. وأنا كان معي بنت كان ذيك الليلة جو ناس خطاب لها كلموني فتحوني بالموضوع يشتي يخطبوها فعاد أنا ما قد أتهنيت أني أسعد بنتي إلا صواريخهم فوقنا.
The fighting has killed more than 2,600 people, half of them civilians. It has destroyed the schools, hospitals, and precious cultural heritage. Today, Yemen's very existence hangs in the balance.
By July, the Saudis began running out of bombs and turned to Britain for help. The Cameron government obliged, expediting the delivery of laser-guided munitions manufactured by Raytheon UK. That same month, up to 120 Yemenis lost their lives in an overnight air raid on Yemen's coast.
هذه الحرب القذرة هذه بيتي السلام كان هنا السلام كان يحم هنا الفرحة والبسمة الأطفال كانت هنا انتهت راحت نتيجة الحرب.
In Yemen, 21 million people, 80% of the population, need humanitarian assistance. All sides are showing disregard for human life, but most of the casualties are being caused by airstrikes. I call for an end to the bombings, which are also destroying Yemeni cities, infrastructure, and heritage.
When a dictator slaughters tens of thousands of his own people, that is not just a matter of one nation's internal affairs. It breeds human suffering on an order of magnitude that affects us all. Likewise, when a terrorist group beheads captives, slaughters the innocent, and enslaves women, it's not a single nation's national security problem. That is an assault on all our humanity.
That evening, more than 130 Yemenis lost their lives when Saudi jets bombed a wedding party in Taiz province. One of the worst atrocities since the war began. Most of the dead were women and children.
We heard the planes in the sky coming and then they struck. 3 people were killed. Then the planes came back again and struck directly in the house where the wedding party with the women were. Only the women.
10 days after the massacre, another wedding was bombed by coalition warplanes, killing 47 people. The following month, Washington resupplied the Saudi Air Force with over 18,000 fresh munitions.
State Department lawyers warned the Obama administration, this is right at the beginning of the war, they warned the Obama administration, look, these are potentially war crimes that the Saudis are committing, and if they're committing war crimes with our help, then we're legally exposed as well. You can't get a Russian ammunition supplier to supply bombs and missiles that fit onto an American-made jet. That's not how this stuff works. In any case, even if they could have turned somewhere else, there's the fundamental moral injunction against being an accessory to mass murder.
Every Yemeni believe that Saudi Arabia would not have done that at all, would not have done a war in Yemen without the approval of Obama. And it is very clear to everyone. Obama wanted to appease the Saudis after the Iranian nuclear deal, but unfortunately he appeased them by the Yemeni blood.
For Obama, this was really appeasing the Saudis. So Saudi was blindsided by the Iran deal. They were furious. We just kind of gave this to the Saudis as like, please forgive us for the Iran deal.
We have forged a new beginning between America and the Muslim world, one that recognizes our mutual interest in breaking a cycle of conflict, and that promises a future in which those who kill innocents are isolated by those who stand up for peace and prosperity and human dignity.
When Yemenis see "Made in America" on the bombs that are killing them, it tells them that the United States is responsible for this war. That is the sad truth.
Coalition forces have conducted airstrikes targeting civilians and civilian objects in violation of international humanitarian law, including camps for internally displaced persons and refugees, civilian residential areas, medical facilities, schools and mosques. These are very disturbing reports. In the light of this, will the Prime Minister agree to launch immediately an inquiry and a full review into the arms export licences to Saudi Arabia and suspend those arms sales until that review has been concluded?
Well, as the Right Honourable Gentleman knows, we have the strictest rules for arms exports of almost any country anywhere in the world. And let me remind him, we are not a member of the Saudi-led coalition. We're not directly involved in the Saudi-led coalition's operations. British personnel are not involved in carrying out strikes. I will look at this report as I look at all other reports. But our arms exports are carefully controlled, and we are backing the legitimate government of the Yemen, not least because terrorist attacks planned in the Yemen would have a direct effect on people in our country. I refuse to run a foreign policy by press release, which is what he wants. I want a foreign policy that's in the interests of the British people.
In 2016, Britain's then Business Secretary, Sajid Javid, ignored legal advice to suspend the flow of arms. The same day as Europe was voting in favour of an arms embargo on Saudi, Cameron encouraged more.
Hopefully good news coming from Kuwait, and the Italians have been doing a lot of work there. Obviously the British have been working very hard in Oman, and I can see the planes being built right behind me here. We've got more work to do in Saudi Arabia.
That weekend, the coalition bombed a crowded market in Yemen, killing and wounding 70. More than 100 civilians were killed, said UNICEF, in a similar strike in Hajar province.
Coalition airstrikes in particular continues to strike hospitals, schools, mosques, and civilian infrastructures.
The Saudis deny that there have been any breaches of international humanitarian law. Obviously, that denial alone is not enough. We need to see proper investigations we need to work with the Saudis to establish that international humanitarian law has been complied with.
We are aware of the allegations that have been made by a variety of sources, including the UN panel of experts in their recent report. And we've looked at this very, very closely and take these very, very seriously indeed. But as I shared with the House in the past, this report was conducted by people who did not enter the country. They used satellite technology in order to make their assessments. If there was not the formation of the coalition, the Houthis would have pressed down to the port of Aden, and the scale of the humanitarian disaster in that country would be a lot worse than we're facing now. There is another adversary to this side that are actually in breach of many humanitarian laws, not least the use of child soldiers and so forth. This is not to exonerate any coalition mistake that is actually made.
The MOD assessment is that the Saudi-led coalition is not targeting civilians, that Saudi processes and procedures have been put in place to ensure respect for the principles of international humanitarian law, and that the Saudis both have been and continue to be genuinely committed to compliance with international humanitarian law.
Late yesterday, the government admitted misleading Parliament on 6 different occasions, telling MPs they'd assessed Saudi conduct when they hadn't. The previous line was,
"We have assessed that there has not been a breach of international humanitarian law by the coalition."
But now the line is,
"We have not assessed that there has not been a breach of international humanitarian law by the coalition."
Saudi Arabia, whatever criticisms we make of it, is also actively helping the United Nations supervision of humanitarian assistance in Yemen, and my understanding is that Saudi Arabia is also the largest single bilateral donor to the humanitarian relief that is taking place in Yemen. So those things too need to be weighed in any overall judgment.
The UN Secretary-General coming to explain to reporters his recent controversial decision. The Saudi-led coalition had been included on a UN blacklist because of child casualties in Yemen, but he decided to remove them from the list.
It is unacceptable for member states to exert undue pressure.
Minutes later, the Saudi ambassador to the UN came to the same podium, strongly denying he'd threatened to withdraw any funding.
You say there were no threats, no pressure. He says he faced undue pressure.
Well, I can only speak for what we did. We did not exercise pressure or intimidation.
In a low-key visit to Washington, Mohammed bin Salman, the architect of the Saudi war, received a warm reception at the Obama White House. A bipartisan resolution to stop the next arms transfer was blocked by US lawmakers. In a move condemned by human rights groups, Britain blocked a proposal from the Netherlands for a UN inquiry into potential war crimes.
We have been honest with the Saudis about our concerns over the lack of precision in some strikes, and we've talked to them about the importance of conducting investigations into those strikes, and we know that, that they continue to do that, to investigate.
And the results of that investigation led to a number of important steps being taken by the Saudis to avoid any such incident happening again. There were changes to procedures.
It is, of course, important to determine the facts of any incident, and the Saudis set out their own internal investigation procedures, which are very welcome.
وبعدين جينا ندخل نسعف فإذا بالضربة الثانية فعلت مجزرة مروعة بالمئات بالعشرات تحت الأنقاض. عزاء جاوا يعزوا.
أقوم أسكت يعني نفسي ذاك الساعة أطير أهرب يعني أقوم أسكت وما أشبه هذا.
Hussein's leg was trapped in the rubble. Desperate to get out, Hussein and his father drew their daggers to cut it off. The decision saved his life.
إحنا كلنا متوقعين الصاروخ الثاني اللي جينا كان ما يكفيش واحد، هم هكذا يعملوا دائما في كل مكان.
4 weeks after the massacre, Britain's then Trade Secretary, Liam Fox, received the go-ahead from Boris Johnson to continue the flow of British arms. The threshold for refusal, wrote Johnson, has not yet been reached.
So far, we do not believe that there has been a clear risk of breach of international humanitarian law in respect
of the UN panel
of the use of those weapons.
But the UN panel has said there's been 191 violations of human rights in those attacks, and we're talking about British Brimstone missiles, Typhoon jets, and British help in targeting.
We are, you're asking a very important question, because we are very concerned about what is happening, and we have raised our concerns repeatedly with the Saudis.
At Westminster, Labour and Tory MPs conspired together to sabotage a motion to end Britain's support.
You mentioned that the war in Ukraine and your support for the war in Ukraine was indicative of support for democracy and freedom. And you also noted the importance of deterring dictators from learning the wrong lessons of how you respond in Ukraine. How do you think the world is responding and observing the UK's continued support for Saudi Arabia, the continued provision of armaments to Saudi Arabia in a war that has killed far, far more people than Putin has killed in Ukraine? And particularly 5 years on the anniversary of Jamal Khashoggi's murder, it's now reported that your prime minister is going to be hosting Mohammed bin Salman, rolling out the red carpet for him in London. How do you think the world is going to observe that? Do you think people are really buying that this is about democracy and freedom when your government is supporting tyranny and tyrants?
I was in Abu Dhabi when Houthi missiles flew across the sky, and I watched the Emirati air defense systems intercept Houthi missiles provided by Iran. I know Saudi Arabia has been at the receiving end of Houthi missiles. The idea that countries in the Gulf defend themselves is in any way analogous to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think is a fundamental error of assessment. I think it's a category error. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the most clear-cut modern example of imperial expansionism that any of us have probably seen in our lifetime. And if you blur the lines on what is a clear-cut battle of good and evil, I think you're making a fundamental mistake.
I think there's a degree of narcissism in the political discourse that approaches these issues when it's our enemies as a kind of big morality tower, in which the centre of the morality tower is not the actual victims, but ourselves as the good guys in world politics, and wherein other instances of aggression, of war crimes, etc., become invisible and incomprehensible because they don't fit that pattern. When they do stuff like this, it suddenly becomes a huge issue, in a way that's very convenient to a pre-existing worldview, where we can say, look at our enemies behaving as they do with pathological evil. It's now time for us, the good guys, to step in and do the right thing. In a way, it's quite narcissistic.
This looks like a job for Superman.
But this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
What's
compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
The story about how quiet everyone has been about Yemen and how loud they have been about Ukraine, I think is just an enormous, clear example of where power lies, and power is served by silencing the war on Yemen and highlighting the war in Ukraine.
Ansar Allah has developed a highly repressive police state. In a macabre spectacle that shocked the nation, 8 men and a teenager were publicly executed in 2021 after desperate pleas for mercy from their families. 17-year-old Abdulaziz al-Aswad was half paralysed from 3 years of torture, accused along with the others of aiding Abu Dhabi. Yemeni journalist Mahmoud al-Adeimi was about to expose the massive forgery at the heart of the case when his car exploded in downtown Aden, killing his wife and colleague Rasha al-Harazi. One of 45 journalists killed in the conflict, Rasha was 25 years old and pregnant with their second son.
So basically, there are no white hands when it comes to the war in Yemen. And we keep emphasizing the fact that all parties to the conflict, they committed violations of war crimes, arbitrary detention, torture, and also disappearance.
The Associated Press spoke with about 24 people who say they survived or witnessed torture within Houthi detention sites. Anas al-Sarari says his captors hung him from the ceiling by handcuffs for 23 hours a day. Released after 4 months, the 26-year-old activist is now paralyzed.
يعني مثلا كهربوني هذا أخف من هذا أكثر شد من الكهرباء. القتل أخف من التعليق. لأن التعليق العذاب فيه في الفترة اللي بيجلس فيها.
A committee led by the Houthi leader's brother was set up to examine reports of torture and indefinite detentions. The committee says it freed more than 13,000 people in its first 3 months. Eventually, hardline security commanders shut it down.
When it comes to civil society, to detention, forced disappearance, and torture, and also the freedoms in general, this is, types of violations that is practiced by all parties to the conflict.
A former British protectorate, South Yemen is rich in oil and natural gas. Home to around 1 in 5 Yemenis, her coastline butts along the Bab al-Mandab, a maritime choke point through which millions of barrels of oil pass per day. In recent years, the UAE has built a network of bases and ports in the Horn of Africa, positioning herself for future trade with China and projecting power into the Red Sea, a key transit for global trade.
What's happening that the United Arab Emirates, especially the United Arab Emirates, decided to support militias or armed groups under what is called now the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, and many of the areas now that is supposed to be controlled by the government is controlled by different armed groups supported by the United Arab Emirates.
The separatists of South Yemen, the old Yemenis who are now saying, look, this whole Yemen project has been a disaster for us. We're basically being colonized by these wackos coming from the north who are acculturated in Saudi Arabia. All of our natural resources, all of Yemen's natural resources are in the former South Yemen. So why are we so poor? Why are we facing all these takfirism, radicalism? What has happened to our world? We want to go back to what it was like before. And that's where the UAE has influence. They have influence in this separatist southern elements. What happened during the interim government in Yemen itself, where a lot of these contracts that were that benefited Dubai and the UAE more generally were ripped apart on certain flimsy legal arguments that these were contracts that need to be renegotiated, and the main beneficiaries would be especially Qatari companies. They would love to see South Yemen partition again, and they would be the main supporters of this largely secular, commercial-oriented southern government, which would allow for Dubai Port World to maintain their assets on the ports, and Abu Dhabi would be able to gain the lion's share of the oil wealth, do deals with China, and in the meantime keep Qatar and Saudi Arabia at bay. The fisheries off of Yemen is a story untold. There have been reports you can find, complaints from the industry that they're only tapping into 5 to 10% of their annual capacity. That there's tens of billions of dollars to be made.
And then you also have Socotra. So Socotra is a Yemeni island that 40% of its biodiversity exists nowhere else in the world. It's just truly a magical place as an indigenous population as well that speaks its own language that basically predates Arabic. Really a unique place in the world and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And under Yemeni control, it was very protected. It was very preserved. This is a pride of Yemen, Socotra. The UAE has fully taken control. They're building military bases. They're building huge hotels. They're really trying to turn this into Dubai 2.0, right? They're trying to make this a tourist Disneyland attraction.
The UAE operation with Israeli technical support. So Israeli soldiers and technicians are on the island. They now have full control over maritime and air traffic, the Western Indian Ocean. It's a huge expansion of Israeli influence now, thanks to this war. There are economic assets to be gained from occupying Socotra. It's an amazing, unique ecosystem that will, of course, be exploited to the point where it no longer produces the kind of ecotourism that is now being marketed. There's most likely lots of oil and gas where they will be happy to destroy the unique ecosystem once that becomes economically viable.
They're giving key strategic benefits to key leaders. So, for example, some sheikhs are allowed to go to the UAE for medical treatment, or will get even citizenship if they're important enough. So you do see some benefits for the indigenous population, but at very high costs that are going to be long-term. And that is shifting their way of life and destroying the habitat they've been living in harmony with.
Somalia and the Horn of Africa geologically is the same as Yemen. So all this oil and gas they're finding off Somalia's territories, the logic is that it also exists off the shore in Yemen. So there's far more oil and gas, it is clear, off Yemen's coasts than anyone is willing to suggest.
In 2018, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, made an official state visit to the United Kingdom. At Westminster, 27 MPs signed a motion opposing the red carpet treatment.
We're here voicing the concerns of the British public, both concerns over what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen and the UK's complicity by selling war arms to them. And as you can see behind us, the Crown Prince is, while he's counting up the death toll, the UK continues to count its cash that it's making over arms deals.
The only thing these people will understand is a full embargo on all the arms sales, and we stop all the arms sales now.
This man is blockading aid to Yemen, allowing people to starve. This is a man who is a serial human rights abuser.
I look forward to welcoming Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman from Saudi Arabia to this. Well, Labour backbenchers from sedentary positions are shouting shame. Can I just say to those backbenchers that the link that we have with Saudi Arabia is historic, it is an important one, and it has saved the lives of potentially hundreds of people in this country.
British arms exports to Saudi steadily increased under Theresa May. At Chequers, Salman secured a deal for 4 dozen Typhoon bombers. Theresa's husband, Sir Philip May, is a senior executive at Capital Group, the main shareholder in BAE Systems, which manufactures the Typhoon. Salman's next stop was the United States. The new president, Donald Trump, heaped praise on the autocrat, offering him more than $100 billion in weapons contracts.
Dollars, $3 billion, $533 million, $525 million. That's peanuts for you. Should have increased it. $880 million, $645 million, $6 billion. That's for frigates.
This was fake news. The lion's share had already been offered by his predecessor Barack Obama, who brokered more US arms deals around the world than any other post-war president. Salman met with some of the biggest names in the US elites. The liberal press in Britain and America depicted Salman as a progressive reformer.
What did you learn about him? Well, that he's bold, he's visionary, but he's also been called reckless and impulsive. Saudi Arabia is important, but what he does in Saudi Arabia can change the entire Middle East.
What I thought was most amazing is to hear a Saudi leader talk so specifically about what women can wear. I think the Crown Prince, in a lot of ways, he reminds me of one of those eternal optimists like Franklin Roosevelt or Reagan.
The world's worst humanitarian crisis was not mentioned once by 60 Minutes. Yemeni lives were of no interest.
Before dawn, Operation Golden Victory began. Saudi coalition troops advanced on Hodeidah after fighter jets and warships had bombed Houthi targets first.
In 2018, Saudi Arabia and the UAE launched a major offensive to retake the Yemeni port city of Hodeidah. Their objective was to seize the airport, the seaport, and the main route to the capital. The United Nations warned of a major catastrophe.
80 to 90% of the food that Yemeni people rely on is imported, and of the 80 to 90%, 70% is coming through the port of Hodeidah. So it's a critical lifeline, not only for those in Hodeidah city, but for the rest of the country. This could push an extra 1 million children to the brink of famine in already what is the world's largest humanitarian crisis. There must be a de-escalation of activities around the city to ensure that that lifeline remains open.
At the outset, Abu Dhabi said it would not go ahead with the assault without the approval of Washington and London. A last-minute ceasefire proposal from Sweden was blocked by the Security Council. In the months that followed, thousands of civilians were killed and displaced.
Started walking, carrying our children while the Apache helicopters hovered above. We were scared, not knowing whether we'll be shot or not. We prayed we wouldn't get hit. There was nothing we could do.
Your mission is a safer, more secure world. Our promise is to help make it happen.
Much of what we saw of the aftermath of this attack is too graphic to show on air. Some of those images that I watched showed dismembered limbs of children piled up in the back of pickup trucks. It showed children who had been burnt so badly that their facial features were indistinguishable. It showed children trying to crawl to safety.
You know, here were these kids on a school trip. They were excited. There's footage. We see them laughing and really being excited. Some of the parents said that they couldn't really sleep the night before because they're so looking forward to, you know, and here's the sad part. They're going to a cemetery just to be able to enjoy some time outside. And, you know, as the bus entered a busy market, it was targeted by the Saudi-led coalition, and most of these children were killed.
Minutes after the strike, surrounded by dead and dying children, this boy is asked if he's okay. My legs hurt, he says. He had no idea what had just happened, let alone why.
What happened with that bus was truly awful, and I think it's impossible not to be deeply shocked when you find out what happened.
Compelling evidence is emerging that the actual munition that destroyed the bus and killed all those children was an American Lockheed Martin bomb. Are you going to use your meetings here in Washington to urge the administration to review their entire approach to the war in Yemen, just as you apparently may be willing to do?
We are, of course, going to be talking about the Yemen situation with the administration here. And I think they have a very similar approach to us. But as far as Britain's concerned, when it comes to arms sales, we have one of the strictest regimes in the world. And we constantly review whether the arms agreements that we make when we sell them, whether they are being adhered to. The American administration's approach is a matter for them. But both for the United States and for the United Kingdom, you know, we want to make sure that our allies are conducting their activities in a way that we can defend to our own publics, but also respecting that they are allies. And so we will have these discussions, but very often they will be frank discussions in private rather than megaphone diplomacy.
In 2019, Congress made history, and I'm very proud of that. And we did this in a bipartisan way by passing the first ever War Powers Resolution through both chambers of Congress, pressing then President Trump to end this military support. It marked the first time that Congress invoked the War Powers Resolution of 1973 to direct the President to withdraw troops from an undeclared war. Sadly, tragically, President Trump vetoed that resolution.
Campaign Against Arms Trade took the government to court on the grounds that it wasn't implementing its own policy properly. And the government policy is actually very clear. It says that the government will not license arms exports where there is a clear risk that they might be used in a serious violation of international humanitarian law. And Campaign Against Arms Trade were of the view that there was so much publicly available evidence that it was irresponsible and unlawful of the UK government to have allowed arms exports to continue going to Saudi Arabia. And so they took the government to court. In the first round at the High Court, the court found in favour of the government. And at the Court of Appeal in 2019, they won.
The case was brought by the Campaign Against Arms Trade. It says the government licensed arms sales to Saudi despite a risk the weapons could be used to kill civilians.
We disagree with the judgment and will seek permission to appeal. Alongside this, we are carefully considering the implications of the judgment for decision-making. While we do this, we will not grant any new licences for export to Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners, which might be used in the conflict in Yemen.
They stopped issuing new licenses, but they also sneakily amended an existing type of license that allowed companies that were already registered on it, like BAE Systems, to carry on doing deliveries under that license. So equipment was still going to Saudi Arabia, often via RAF Akrotiri, a British military base in Cyprus, and they did a review of their process. And in some ways, that review started off quite well because they treated all potential breaches of international law as if they were actual breaches. But what they then found was that the pattern was inconsistent.
What we can say is that the incidents which have been assessed to be possible violations of international humanitarian law occurred at different times, in different circumstances and for different reasons. And the conclusion was that these are isolated incidents. And on that basis, we believe there is not a clear risk that the export of arms and military equipment to Saudi Arabia might be used in the commission of a serious violation of international humanitarian law.
To anyone who's seen the publicly available evidence, that flies in the face of what we've seen actually happening in Yemen. And the government also relied on secret information by which it said, just because what you see in the public domain suggests that there's a clear risk, we have secret information that means there isn't a clear risk, but the public can never know what that information is. So we have to take on trust what the government says. And frankly, I never do take on trust what the government says. So after that, the government was able to resume issuing arms export licenses to Saudi Arabia and other members of the coalition on the grounds that they had revised their methodology and they now took past patterns into account. So I think to summarise what the effect of the Campaign Against Arms Trade legal action was to really put the spotlight of scrutiny on the government by taking them to court. It released quite a lot of new information into the public domain about how the government was making these decisions. And it also took up a lot of their time and resources in making them defend their position. But ultimately, it did not stop the government approving arms exports to Saudi Arabia.
At the height of the coronavirus pandemic, the British government cut aid to Yemen by 60%, in a move condemned by global charities. At Westminster, Parliament learned how the Johnson government had made no effort to assess the potential impact.
Many of us welcomed the Biden administration's announcement earlier this year that it would end U.S. support for offensive military operations led by Saudi Arabia in Yemen and name a special envoy to help bring this conflict to an end. But the crisis has only continued. American defense contractors continue to service Saudi planes that are waging the war, and the United States military also continues to provide intelligence to the Saudi armed forces. And now, tonight, we are looking at a new $650 million arms sale to the Saudi armed forces.
Red Cross officials who visited the site said the airstrikes had hit a detention centre, killing at least 100 people. And they said bodies were still being pulled from the rubble.
Another airstrike hit a telecommunications centre in the key port city of Hodeidah, knocking out the internet across Yemen. 3 children playing football nearby were killed in that strike.
The reality is that the British and the Americans could have pulled the plug at any time they wanted. You know, those planes could not fly without ongoing British and American support. And if the British and Americans had said, look, we're not going to be complicit in the indiscriminate bombing of civilian targets. We're not going to be complicit in the deliberate imposition of a humanitarian crisis on this poor country. If that's how you want to use our planes, then, you know, tough luck. We're not going to be part of that. So we're going to stop providing maintenance. We're going to stop providing ammunition, spare parts and components. Those planes would be grounded within not long. That should cost people their jobs at the minimum. Possibly it should put people in the dock as well. And if that doesn't happen, then there's a real problem with how our system works. If people can do those things and just get away with it. And that's quite dangerous for the future, because there's no disincentive for the government not to do those things again, or for the British state not to act in a similar way.
Yemen's UN-brokered 6-month truce officially ended in October, but still largely holds. Around 900 prisoners will be released in the exchange. It's part of a deal reached in negotiations between the two sides seeking an end to the near 9-year war mediated by Oman. Last month, Saudi Arabia and Iran agreed to end their 7-year diplomatic rift and re-establish diplomatic ties in a deal brokered by China.
This is the first concrete result of not only Omani mediation, but the Iran-Saudi agreement, which is beginning to bear fruit in Yemen, at least, if not yet elsewhere in the region.
When Yemen, northern Yemen, when it was still a monarchy, they joined the UN. They were in 1947. They were among 5 countries that walked out of the UN meeting when they voted to partition Palestine. When in the 60s, there was a war between Egypt and Israel, the communists in South Yemen closed Bab el-Mandeb in solidarity with Palestine. When the Palestinian leadership was kicked out of Lebanon, they were welcomed with open arms by Ali Abdullah Saleh, the president. And so no matter what system we've had in power and government in Yemen, there's always been material and moral support to the Palestinian. And I think part of that is because, we mentioned Yemen as the homeland of Arabs. And so there's a sense of Arab nationalism and pan-Arabism there. But also, we are a colonized people. We know what that looks like. We know the consequences of that. And we know oppression when we see it because we've experienced it. And so there's this long-running solidarity with the Yemeni people that you're seeing now manifest through Houthi leadership.
Since the start of the Gaza war, the Houthis have been targeting commercial ships in the Red Sea and firing ballistic missiles at Israel. Neither American nor Israeli strikes bringing an end to their repeated missile fire, which set off sirens in Tel Aviv this morning once again.
I mean, there are many who are saying that, frankly, the Biden administration should have acted sooner and faster, that hundreds of billions of dollars has been put at risk because the Houthis have held this area in the Red Sea at ransom.
Sorry, so just let me get this straight, Yalda. So we are bombing one of the poorest countries in the world that has been under a humanitarian blockade. There has been famine. These people have been decimated. And we are bombing them because a couple of guys in dinghies in support for the Palestinians who are having a genocide committed against them. They're objecting to that, and we're bombing them. Come on now. I mean, this is just an insane world for us to even think. I'm so sorry your Amazon packages are delayed. I really am. Like, I wish mine came on time. But, genocide, guys, genocide. There are 2 mothers a day dying in Gaza right now. It's 109 days into a conflict in which a humanitarian crisis has been declared to the world day in, day out.
By the way, Dr. Francois, there are many who are Yemen watchers who monitor and follow the Houthis who say this is doing wonders for their branding, actually, that it isn't just the Palestinian cause that they're focused on.
So call a ceasefire now and end the positive branding. If you want to stop the Houthis doing what they're doing, then call a ceasefire
Do you genuinely believe
right
that
now.
the Houthis would stop doing what they're doing?
They have literally said that that's why they're doing what they're doing. They have not previously blocked those routes for any other reason except this one. So yes, I do. And I also think the West needs to start to understand that you cannot just go around playing cowboys in the world. There are consequences to your actions. You cannot just go around bombing people's countries, ignoring international law and expect no repercussions.
These people are creating a total trade blockade, which is causing inflation, which is causing all sorts of problems to everybody.
25,000 people are dead in Gaza right now. There are over 60,000 people injured with no access to food, water, aid. How dare we have a conversation about trade when there are children right now being treated without anesthetic?
Well,
there are things that require us to make some sacrifices, and this would be one of them.
They do have the global economy, global markets hostage.
Good for them.
All those Europeans with their smug superiority about European civilization and human rights and the dignity of man. And then when the moment of truth came, who stood by the people of Gaza? It was the Houthis, who look like they're a throwback to the Dark Ages with their daggers and their robes, but they threw down the gauntlet to the whole world. There will be no business as usual while the people of Gaza are being subjected to a genocide. You want to carry on your commerce? You want to carry on your trade? You want to pretend as if nothing is happening? The Houthis said, it's not going to happen. There won't be trade. There won't be commerce, at least in our neighborhood. At least in our neighborhood. Those primitive, backward Houthis showed more moral enlightenment, more compassion than all of those civilized European countries.
We don't fucking give a shit to them, and we don't care, and they will never scare us. They will never stop us. We are coming from Yemen, from Sana'a to Palestine very soon, inshallah, because we are with our leader, Sayyid Abdul Malik Badruddin al-Houthi, and we know that we are in the right side, so no one can stop us. We know our way. We know that we are in the right side, so we're gonna come to the White House, and we will change it from the White House to the Black House and Dirty House.
رسالتنا للعدو الأمريكي الإسرائيلي أنه مهما حصل من تحديات في البحر الأحمر ومهما عمل من إجراءات تعسفية ضد القوات البحرية اليمنية فهذا لن يخيفنا ولن يرهبنا ولن يوقف من عزمنا وصلابتنا تجاه موقفنا تجاه القضية الفلسطينية.
إنها قضيتنا الأولى لن نتخلى عنها أبدا، والله لو فنينا عن بكرة أبينا لن نتخلى عن هذه القضية، فهي القضية المركزية لكل شعوب الأحرار، لكل الشعوب الأحرار، لكل شعوب الأمة.
من هنا من اليمن من ميدان السبعين نعلن الصرخة في وجه المستكبرين. الله أكبر، الموت أمريكا، الموت إسرائيل.
لن يؤثر على قرارنا، نحن مصممون على هذا القرار وهذا الموقف، ولن يؤثر على إرادتنا وعزمنا. نحن في عمل مقدس نعتبره جزءا من جهادنا في سبيل الله سبحانه وتعالى.
The spotlight is on them because of the silence of all of the regional players right now. And it's a shameful silence. It doesn't have to be done this way. You know, like if the Saudis, for example, limited oil production just for a week, we could see what kind of impact that would have on Israel's and certainly the U.S. support for Israel. Instead, they just make these statements that are empty statements, and they just essentially, through their silence, are supporting whatever is happening in Palestine.
كل يوم المشهد بتكرر كل يوم، ومع هيك الكل ساكت، عالم صامت متخاذل. حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل. بس هيك عالم، هيك عروبة.
حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل على حكامنا العرب وملوكنا العرب. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل حكامنا هدول اللي هيشهدوا عليهم. والله ما احنا مسامحينهم ليوم الموقف العظيم. والله ما احنا مسامحين ولا عربي بيقول عن حاله مسلم. والله ما احنا مسامحينهم وبس.
انا بقول للسيد السيسي حفظه الله يعني يقف معنا، يقف مع اطفال غزه. بقول لمحمد بن سليمان طردوا السفاره البريطانيه، طردوا الالمانيه، طردوا الفرنسيه، طردوا الغرب من عندكم. هاي بكتلوا اولادنا في سلاحهم. هاي السلاح الالماني والسلاح الفرنسي، هاي السلاح الالماني والفرنسي والسلاح الامريكي. هاي شايفين هاي اطفال.
Well, Israel could not have lasted this long without the continuation of these despotic regimes across the Arab world. These governments are the product of the world order that started forming by the end of the First World War and brought to an end the Ottoman Caliphate and created in much of its territory entities loyal to the victors in the wars. So Palestine is one of the symptoms. Arabs are living in a prison, and their jailers are their rulers who deny them their basic rights and who steal their wealth and smuggle it elsewhere. I firmly believe that Palestine will not be completely free until the Arabs around it are free.
The Houthis have had their own goals and objectives by riding the wave of supporting Gaza. Yes, of course, they feel strongly about what's happening there, but they also have their ulterior motives. Because to the Houthis, they need to be in this constant state of conflict. That's how they guarantee staying in power. This is why even 30 years ago, they've always been saying, we're going to go to war against the US. We're going to go to war against Israel. And everybody was like, are you insane? You're like in this limited geographic area up in the mountains. What are you talking about? But they knew that by promising something that is unattainable, they will continue to misguide. They'll continue to kind of galvanize and rile up their base. And now that Israel is actually bombing Yemen, it's bolstering their call. And people are worried. They're like, if Israel launches something even close to the scale of what they've done in Gaza, they will level cities in Yemen. And of course, they're angry with Israel, but they're also angry with the Houthis for bringing about this devastation. They're like, Houthis kept poking the bear, and they're inviting this doomsday scenario.
Issa Bloomy is a Middle East historian whose 2018 book, Destroying Yemen, tells a hidden history of Yemeni struggle to remain independent in the face of empire.
The needs of capitalist imperialism and those who will harness capitalist imperialism as a tool to secure and expand their power over fellow human beings, over the resources that human beings live under, would evolve over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries that would directly implicate Yemen for different reasons. By the end of World War I, with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, in which the British and the French would secure spheres of influence through their self-imposed mandates over Ottoman territories of the Middle East. And this in itself could have included Yemen, but after a brief foray, it became clear that militarily it would have been too costly to actually proceed to occupy the Imamate of North Yemen, really the only independent Arab state at this time, and perhaps in the larger Islamic world. That's a quite interesting fact that by the end of World War I, there were no other sovereign states without British or French occupying forces out there. One of the first countries to say no to the Zionist project was the Imamate of Yemen, North Yemen. The Imamate of North Yemen was one of the few countries on principle that refused to subordinate itself to the Cold War itself, the logic of the Cold War. Suspicious of this whole officers movement in Egypt. They had a very interesting perspective on how the world functioned. They were deemed and called backward, medieval.
People who roam its narrow, dusty streets have lived for centuries in deep-frozen barbarity, which has only occasionally been disturbed by the probing of the outside world.
They did not have a central bank. Money, if countries wanted to do trade, they would have to bring bags of silver and gold still, which was very frustrating in a newly emerging kind of global economy based on the dollar. They were able to balance off Maoist China, Soviet Union. They brought the Swedes in and invited the Americans to also provide aid and help build infrastructure. But even then, the Americans proved to be far less capable of being good partners in helping develop countries. And the Imam recognized yet again that they needed to throw them out because they were just simply, they refused to train local labor. They were importing cheap labor from Eritrea or from elsewhere. So the kind of typical greed that comes with empire. It continued to maintain on its own terms how they're going to organize their society. And that reflected even after the tragic almost 10 years of civil war that was induced by this coup of 1962. The British invested heavily in forming political alliances with other ruling families in what becomes known as this federation of sultanates of South Yemen, which would ultimately translate during the Cold War and by the late 1960s into an all-out insurgency against the British Empire, against imperialism, against these sultanates, part of this larger global phenomenon of anti-colonialism. And South Yemen became the kind of hub and inspiration for the Algerians and for East Africans.
تحيا اليمن تحيا اليمن تحيا اليمن.
The constant efforts to subdue Yemen, and the latest being after the so-called Arab Spring of 2011, to impose an interim government that would benefit and suit and service the interests of this process of forcefully integrating Yemen into the global economy, to redraw the constitution, to create a federation that would completely marginalize the vast majority of the people of Yemen. No, we will not accept this. The assumption was that militarily they can win very quickly. They misread Yemenis. The fact that Ansar Allah, the resistance, were now firing drones and sometimes ballistic missiles into the cities of the UAE, of Abu Dhabi, and of Saudi Arabia, destroying oil infrastructure, meant this war had to stop.
Awa Moqdad is a Yemeni American who supports humanitarian operations in Yemen.
I was going across the country visiting health centers. The situation's quite dire, but what blew me away was these Yemeni doctors and Yemeni staff who are working without salaries and still running these hospitals, with limited supplies and still running these hospitals. Really seeing the role of women change as well in Yemen. I think there's a lot about, this oppressed Yemeni woman, which, yes, it is happening, but it was so fascinating. Growing up, I would go to Yemen every summer. There wasn't that much to do as a woman, to be quite frank. And now with the war, I think women need more economic opportunities. The situation is just desperate. And then a lot of men have passed away, which means women have to become breadwinners of the family. So you see these female-only cafes popping up everywhere. And I remember growing up, I would have loved to have these spaces, but they just didn't exist. And that was really incredible. My favorite restaurant was actually in the Old City, top floor restaurant, woman only, woman run. And then the bottom floor offered computer lessons for women. So you're seeing a lot of progress. And this goes back to this idea of hope, where I think Yemenis are taking this initiative, right? Even with getting dealt the worst hand possible, Yemenis are still taking the initiative and doing outstanding work on the ground. And I think this also pushed back against narratives of, the Middle East, we just need Westerners to save us. Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, it's Yemeni-based, it's Yemeni-led. And that's why we're able to do amazing work and access all these areas and work with local vendors. So for our food baskets, which is one of our main programs, we only buy from the local economy. So if in that area they're known for grain, we're getting grain. If they're known for eggs, we're buying the eggs. And usually people are willing to give us deals. I mean, it's really inspiring when you see the efforts of Yemenis on the ground.
Nearly 2,000 years old, the ancient city of Shibam is a timeless symbol of Yemeni civilization. Her unique mud brick skyscrapers, first built in the 16th century, have earned her the nickname Manhattan of the Desert. Much of Yemen's historic architecture has been damaged or destroyed by the warring parties. At the time it was levelled by Saudi bombs, Thamar Museum was home to thousands of priceless artefacts, as was Taiz Museum when it was levelled by the Houthis. Yemen's cultural capital, the Houthis have imposed a brutal siege on Taiz, subjecting residents to indiscriminate shelling and restricted access to food and water. Apart from the main road, the siege on Taiz remains, in violation of Yemen's ceasefire. Under a project run by UNESCO, ordinary Yemenis have restored thousands of these buildings, in a stark reminder of Yemeni pride and resolve, determined as ever to rebuild their country.
I would say that we've kind of been sidelined by many in the Arab world as and looked down upon, frankly, as being, quote unquote, the poorest country in the Middle East, as though we weren't exploited and, made impoverished by the various events that happened. But there's this, and even if we were, like, so what, but I think they've been dismissed for quite a while. When the Saudis began bombing in Yemen in 2015, there was very little support for the Yemeni population. There has not been like this, mobilization for our cause. You don't see these protests in the Arab world in solidarity of Yemen. It felt like we were just yelling into the void for all of these years, trying to get people to pay attention to what's happening in Yemen and to stop their own governments from bombing us. It wasn't a call for help. It was a call for ending hostilities, ending these, whether it was the US's influence in bombing in Yemen or the UK's support for it or the Saudi or UAE, but we didn't have that mass mobilization. And so we felt, and many Yemenis have felt, absolutely ignored by the rest of the world and by our Arab neighbors who ganged up on us essentially when we posed no threat to their security whatsoever. I don't know how sustained this will be, but in this moment, there's a perceptible shift in how Yemenis are being seen by their neighbors.
It depends entirely on the mechanisms of information distribution. If you can silence and keep obscure an event in faraway Yemen or an event in faraway eastern Ukraine for many years, right? And then there is not going to be a resulting spread of consciousness in the public. And certainly when Hollywood stars embrace a cause, they're done so with the approval of the same enterprises that control our access to information about in the larger world. And people are still very generous in their hearts. The working class people of Europe and North America, who are probably quite marginal political sense of things these days anyways, they could nevertheless go out in the streets and cause problems. And so this is why there's still investment in trying to convince them about how to think about and look at the world, whether it is to be upset about a war that is expanded now in Ukraine or to be ignorant of what's happening in central Congo or in Yemen and in other areas where clearly empire is heavily invested in violence on indigenous people for a number of reasons.
My time in Yemen and my work with Yemen Relief and Construction Foundation has really showed me if foreigners are out of our country, Yemenis can come together, and we will, right? This is the future of our country. When I describe Yemen to people, the social fabric is so strong. I've never met a Yemeni that I haven't had some connection to in some way. And this is a country of 30 million. So there's so much hope within the Yemeni community itself. But the question is, how do we get countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the West out and let them create space. Let us set this agenda, right? It's the future of our country, not theirs.